Hi, and welcome to the DAOI Expert Series podcast. I'm Robert Coons. I'm really excited today to present you with this interview with my friend Josh Paynter. Josh is a 22nd generation Longmen Daoist priest, and he, together with his friend Jack Schaefer, run the Parting Clouds Daoist Education School in the United States. They're a very interesting school who have already successfully produced several cohorts of Taoist disciples, some of whom who have gone on to become priests in their own right. This was a really interesting interview. The main topic was to discuss those elements in the Taoist community which sometimes are problematic, and how to understand the difference between authentic and inauthentic practice. So it was a really fascinating interview. I was very, very happy to be able to finally have Josh on the show, and I think you're going to love it. So enjoy. Welcome, Josh, to the show.
Thank you, Robbie. I'm glad to be here. Finally, right? I mean, we've danced around this for a while, and I've taken a recent sort of year-long hiatus from podcasts, and I'm glad that this is my first one back.
Yeah, well, great. And
Safe territory with you.
yeah, I hope so. And
Yeah.
today is a very auspicious day. I do have to mention to everybody that there's a construction crew digging up my street, so you may hear a little bit of outer interference, but I hope that the conversation will warm your heart sufficiently to forgive that. So anyway, you are a Taoist priest.
I am.
So we're not going to go into too much of what that's about, but
Yeah.
give me the small lecture on what that means.
Sure. Well, it's an interesting, I think that the term priest is already I wouldn't call it problematic, but definitely it's something that it's a heavy, it's a laden term, and I, and it is effective. It is true in certain contexts. That is what we do. We perform ritual for the sake of other people, and we act as an intermediary between humanity and other realms. So that is definitively, and we represent a tradition. So that definitely correct, that term. But there are other things that we do that aren't very priestly. You know what I mean? Where it's more like teacher and teacher being authenticated by tradition. So it's both, it's two things really, both priest and teacher. Um, and I think that part of the wording of priest gives people, there's definitely some resistance to that just in the religiosity of the term. And I think that like it's always, I always feel like I have to make an excuse for that, or just sort of like let people off the hook, like, look, I'm not the morality police or something like that. You know what I mean? Priest doesn't mean all of that necessarily. But I'm sure we're actually going to touch on morality today because it is an important part of things. But it's not, Taoist priest essentially is, um, it's very hard to define Taoist within the tradition of Taoism. There are definitely people who are considered Taoists and people who are considered, adherents or people who are interested in it. Um, so in the tradition, when you become an actual committed Taoist, there's a ritual that takes place. That ritual is your entry into the community of Taoists in humanity and Taoists in the celestial realm. There are things written down on papers for the sake of human record keeping, and they're also burned, these registers, for the sake of the celestial bureaucracy. So Taoist ordination, if we're using that term, is really just entry into the community of Taoists, both earthly and celestial. Um, so that is sort of like what that means, commitment and
Yeah, fantastic.
responsibility. Yeah, we're also responsible once you make that commitment. This is now this is like how it should go, and unfortunately, it doesn't always go like this. But once you make that commitment, you're also committing to um, an honest representation of the tradition. You take on of the very important role of aligning yourself with your particular lineage and its doctrinal tenets, and being a living representation of that. Now you can do your own like creative capacities. Like I am me still, obviously. And when I teach, I'll teach it in my style, but there are definitely like parameters that we stay within, these doctrinal parameters, and that is another sort of like dimension of the ordination. It's like they're saying you are now going to commit to representing this authentically, and and then we take that on. So that's kind of like what all of that means. I know it's a tricky term.
Yeah, well, I mean, from my perspective, like the term Taoist priest doesn't exist. We just use it as an English way to describe Daoshi or Daojang or whatever other
Yeah,
levels.
yeah, yeah,
And so that's it's kind of a tricky thing. It's always interesting, right? Because people from the United States or other areas in the Occident, they might hear that word and reflexively apply their own values to it based on their experience of the local religions here, right? And that can be an issue. But moving on from that, um, I think today we have a mission and we have a motive. This is not only a getting to know you interview. We know each other well enough.
yeah.
Uh, some people in the audience will know you, of course, but I think that there's really important seismic level things to talk about in the Taoist world. And there are
Mhm.
many of them, not just what we're talking about today, but what we're talking about today, I think, is really important and interesting, which is that uh, we agreed in our pre-chat that we would have a discussion approximately in the realm of methods of practice, if not being subservient to, I'm going to use the word doctrine here, forgive me, people who don't like that term, but if not subservient to some sort of doctrine, are ineffective, and that studying many methods is an ineffective way to practice if you don't have a background in a solid doctrine, which I would call episteme, but that's a pretty Western view. So
Yeah,
that's our
yeah.
topic today. And I want you to introduce the topic.
Oh, to put into words what you've just said, and well, can you say what you just said in a shorter version
Sure.
that I can respond to?
A lot of people practice so-called Taoist arts, but they don't really
Yes,
know what Taoism consists of. And you
yes.
and me come from very different, almost opposite directions, but we have the benefit of the horseshoe effect. And
Mhm.
so, for those people who may wish to study Taoism, especially Taoist arts, they often misunderstand that there's a deeper, more important part of the tradition which gives the energy to the arts. And it's not just a matter of the practices that you do, it's a matter of a view that you take on as a person who studies Taoism.
Yeah, thank you. That's what I was waiting for. That's something that this is almost that we we did have a pre-talk, but we didn't really discuss any of this. But I think what you've done here is you're kind of like preempting my this is like my central this is becoming my central focus and perspective in the way that I teach, in the way that I receive my own teachings, in the way that I interpret the liturgies and classics that are of my lineage. It's not to say that I'm being creative. It's just to say that I'm finding within the language and within the tradition something very important that really encircles what you're talking about. Like, and it really is exercised most like readily in my relationship to students, particularly incoming new students. And I think that the issue here is that, and you and I both know as representatives of traditions in the Taoist world, um, that part of our job is rectification of, confusion that comes in. And I think that that's the case for any didactic, undertaking whatsoever, or pedagogical undertaking, whether, you know, if you're going to talk about something, people are going to have some idea about what they're there to hear about, and sometimes it will be confluent with your ideas and sometimes not. That's not necessarily what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like entrenched misconceptions. Um, and I think that what's interesting, particularly in the Taoist world, is that it has had free reign. I really hesitate to use that term because it sounds like what I'm not suggesting like a heavy-handed like rulership over the tradition, but I do mean like free reign in a way that there's been too many generations of thinkers who have been thinking about Taoism without talking to Taoists. And in that process, and some of those are great intellectuals too. I'm not just talking about the lay people in the Qigong world and things like that. I'm also talking about like academic circles. So in academia, they're struggling from the same thing too. Like the new scholars are, they're more entrenched in the living tradition than some of their predecessors were, but there's a whole host of books and ideas that were developed and created alongside each other, citing each other and working with each other's ideas, but none of them were really in a good relationship to Taoism in its native form. So like there was a lot of assumptions that became effectively like foundational belief systems. And so that alongside some of the weirder ideas that come in from martial arts communities, qigong communities, and weird is good. Believe me, I'm all about weird sometimes, but in certain cases, it's just so inconsistent that it's not really helpful. That kind of weird. Um, like this stuff all comes in the door, and it's it's tricky because the our responsibility is to be docents to sort of like in a friendly non-confrontational way to lead people um, into better understandings. It's not to confront them and debate them and to argue with them. You know what I mean? But how it's very hard to be gentle with some of the ideas that are, that come in the door, because they're so off base, and some of them are actually like really problematic, actually. Um, and I find that that is everything from the gross into very subtle misunderstandings when we get to really detailed discussions about meditations and meditation and practices like that. This can get really muddy.
Can I throw a bunch of stuff on the table?
Yeah.
Okay, so the very, very first thing is sometimes, just to the audience, to break the fourth wall, sometimes parts of our conversation may seem a little bit stilted or awkward. And one of the reasons for that is because we can't, number one, it would be wrong to mention names of people, including experts. Number two, um, there are certain ways we have to maintain a certain amount of decorum
Mm.
because it's necessary to be able to talk about these things as ideas rather than identifying them in a very, very surgical sense. Otherwise, what can happen is that it will necessarily generate uh, displeasure and dislike in the community, which is opposite to I think to both of our goals. So that's the first thing I wanted to get out of the way. But the
Yeah.
second thing is to throw a bunch of stuff on the table. If we talk in a practical sense about what people in North America think Taoism is, there's three big roads as far as I can tell. One, it's a philosophy from 2,500 years ago that tells us about how to live a good life, and maybe it says something about government. Number
Hmm.
two, it's a bunch of disparate practices that are based on qi. Number
Hmm.
three, it's a kind of a white slash black magic that people in Weird Mountains do. So I think those are the three big roads of the misconception of Taoism in North America, which are endemic. And so if we talk about misconceptions in Taoism, then what we almost have to do is identify what people bring from those three major roads. As far as I can tell, that's my definition. And then to be able to take it apart a bit, to then discuss what is it then that is wrong with those particular views, because they're wrong at the axiomatic level. They're not wrong at the technical level. The technical, they could be right or wrong, but the
Yeah.
idea is wrong at the axiomatic level. So
Yeah.
when we identify that, then it's easier to understand what we're trying to talk about. So what do you think in terms of those three things, philosophy, practice, and magic. How do you interpret that problem, and what is it? What's wrong with it? How do we go forward to rectify it without being power maniacs?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think what's good about those categories that you gave, it's a, by the way, that's a good categorization of things. But I think that what's interesting is that in those categories lie our biggest problems, but in those categories lie our actual identities as well. And so those categories are well accounted for and are very stable components of like my tradition and lineage. So it's not that they're problematic categories, it's how they've been carried out that gets so problematic. And so if people are interested in aspects of those categories, they will find it within the tradition, but they're not necessarily going to find it the way they have found it before or the way they think it is. That's the thing. It's not that I'm, it's not that we're up against people's ideas that we need them to completely junk them or recycle them. It's just that they have to polish off some debris. That's really all that I think needs to happen. But there's so much resistance to that because a lot of people, and this is, I have to say, so many people are going about this with really good intentions and they're really good-natured people. I'm not saying this is a monstrosity out there that, we're up against in some contentious way, these societies of people who are trying to destroy Taoism. I'm saying there are people who adore, love, and abide by this tradition, but they're doing so in their own sort of way of envisioning what it is, you know, um, through bits and pieces and through whatever else they can gather together. They've created their own conglomerate views of this. So all intention is good. All verbalizations are heartfelt and seeking community. This is the thing. It's all beautiful stuff. And I've really learned lately, very much so in the last year, I've been reaching out to a lot of other teachers that I've never had direct confrontation with people. That I don't have not done and I will not do. But I've had my own sort of personal quirks and resistances to certain, um, you know, uh, of the popular, more well-known teachers or whatever. And I know that in the social media world, one person can post one thing and you can really clearly see a response to that. Now, there's anonymity between these things, like no one's really sure if those two are in a battle, but it sure looks like it. You know what I mean? Um, so I've made a personal commitment to reaching out to people and just recognizing each other's really deep commitments, a really humanity driven commitment to these traditions, and recognizing you don't do what I do, I don't do what you do, but it sure looks like we're both doing it seriously. And I'll bet that there's a lot of harmony that could exist between us, and that maybe, and I don't say like, hey, here's a project we should do, but maybe in the future we could communicate about some idea together. And I'm leaving this door open to you because I think that that really needs to happen in the Taoist world. I've taken that on just in my own little life, that I am tired of this type of contention. So that's not what I'm talking about, because that, I think, the human level stuff is really easy to deal with. The ideas, though, are really tricky because when some other teacher, heartfelt and committed, is teaching their students some, and they're calling it doctrine from particularly my sect, Longmen doctrine, but it totally isn't. What do I do then? What do, no matter what I do, the feelings might get hurt. Foundations might get shaken. I don't want to be the cause of discontent, and a lot of people put a lot of their identity goes into these practices, and I don't want to like be part of the reason that someone has some sort of personal crisis or whatever. You know what I mean? And so this is the real like matrix within which teaching this stuff occurs. We have to handle each other so lightly and with so much love and benevolence. And I don't know if that's like, that doesn't seem to be a de facto approach that everyone has.
Not the factory setting.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but at the same time, so I agree with you about being light-handed. I agree with you about also, you didn't say this directly, but if you did, I would agree that the the level of contention in the community is not called for usually.
No.
Because why are we arguing about this thing? Some of the times the doctrinal differences are so small, and it's not even sometimes not even about correct and incorrect. It's just a
Yeah.
tiny little difference, and people will take each other to hell over it, and that's not nice. So I agree with you about those things, but I think that a bit of, let's say, perspective
Mhm.
would be that this isn't merely an Occidental discussion about Taoism, because it's something that has percolated for a long time in China. And the Occidental expression of it is at least partially, if not deeply, influenced by that longer discussion in China. And I think you know what I'm talking about. So,
Absolutely.
what do you think about that?
Well, this is interesting because I think, oh, I'm so glad you brought this up actually, because a lot of like for instance Americans, I would say, I don't know about Canadians, but a
And we're
lot
basically
of
the same.
a lot of the American discourse around Taoism is tied up in the language and um, technology, the rhetorical technology of political discourse. And so I think that that unfortunately, and it comes with all of the political prejudices that you would expect. Um, and so it then becomes a East versus West scenario that in this particular issue, like all things West are misreadings of the tradition, and all things East are authentic readings of the tradition. But then I say to people, are you kidding? The the reason that institutions like temples, like lineages, and like in the most modern iteration of all of these things, the Chinese Taoist Association, the reason they exist is because of the doctrinal maelstrom that can exist when a new teacher decides this is what this means, and then that one says no, that's not, and this is how we do temples, and these are the gods. It can get so chaotic so fast. This issue of um, the negative version of diversity with some sort of doctrinal chaos has been alive and well in China since the get-go. You know, that is the very nature of Taoism. And so I think like this issue is intrinsic to Taoism. It's native to Taoism. Um, we just are using different languages for it, but it's the same issue that's always existed. When you read a lot of, so like you like the Zhongheji. The Zhongheji is a beautiful text on meditation, but it's also a polemic. It's him bashing every other belief system that he disagrees with, page after page. Like, those people are nuts. They were doing that. Those people have no idea what they're talking about. They were doing that. So he states his own eloquent position on the mind, and it's brilliant, but it's also completely infiltrated with pretty robust argumentation. And I'm not talking about the polite kind, you know what I mean? So, I mean, and that's Yuan Dynasty. So this has been going on a long time and
Been
way
going on
before
a
that.
long time.
Yeah,
Before that too. And
it's
I'd
way
just like to
before.
interject really quickly, because there's another great polemic I think of, which is in the text Xingming Guizhi, which is in the, we
Mm,
say it's in the same tradition as Zhongheji.
yep, yep.
And it says stuff like doing the 12 silk brocades at midnight with your eyes closed is something that people who are possessed by demons do.
Yep.
And this kind of stuff. That's by the way paraphrasing. So those of you who are like total experts in this genre, don't kill me. Um, but this is something that I think people could really benefit from knowing that this is a thing. Like, when you read a lot of old Taoist texts, and I think that we need to separate that sometimes texts which are especially associated with meditation really fall victim to this. You can say maybe it was necessary at some point to have those polemics, but
Sure.
then I think if I read it correctly, many of the religious texts don't as much fall prey to that issue, right? Because they're very focused on trying to do a particular thing. Is that true, or are there polemics in the religious? Like, I'm sorry to separate, but what I mean is like, let's imagine like the Sanguan Jing, for instance. The In that text, it's really telling you how to rectify yourself uh, with basically your destiny. And it seems like it has a very positive message that doesn't rely on cutting other things down, except for maybe those things inside of your own ego that are problematic for you, right? I don't know if that reading's accurate or not, but it seems like the meditation, especially Nadan guys, are vicious and really protect the gate. That's something that people should know about this, right? Because um, there's so much to be said about any of these topics, but you have to have a background to view it from.
Yeah. I mean, Taoism um, is very interesting to me in that there's a lot of accoutrement to each particular lineage and in all of its external forms and even the language they use. And some of that's by virtue of time, some of it's by virtue of place. I think we also have to consider the diversity of China, because that's another deeply held Western belief that China is a monolith, both temporally and linguistically and culturally. Clearly, it's not. It is as diverse a place as anything, and people in the North didn't were not doing what people in the South were doing. They don't talk like them or think like them necessarily either, especially when we go back into earlier dynasties. This place was like more like a continent than a nation with lots of states. And in a way, it still is, honestly. But I think that when we recognize the inherent diversity in the philosophical infrastructure of the Chinese view on mind, then we can start getting off of this idea that like there's one thing and that there's one truth to it, blah, blah, blah. I think that what's interesting about Taoism is that there are these essential features of the Tao, its qualities. I don't want to get into that, the emptiness and the rest of those things. We don't have to. Um, but there are strains within the Taoist traditions that have existed from the very get-go. Like literally, the Tao Te Ching is a section on the Tao, the ineffable, and a section on morality and how to live. And so it is those two pieces from the very get-go that continue to be at the very heart of each and every Taoist iteration, whether it be the Tai Ching or the Shang Ching or the Ling Bao or the Qing Wei or the Zheng Yi or the Longmen. At the core is Xing and Ming, the nature of the mind and the nature of our destiny, our morality and our consciousness, our body and our mind. You can have it you can play that out in lots of different dichotomies, but essentially it's all the same approach, which is that there is an ultimate self and there's a conventional self. And these two selves, the ultimate and the conventional, must ultimately be rectified with each other. And I think that a dimension that a lot of people leave out, and to go back to our original question, like when we have students coming to us, they're very method obsessed. They want to know the tricks. They want to know a quick way to be like more powerful or more wise or more perfect in some sense, whatever that may be. They can word it in lots of different ways. But the reality is that they want a shortcut. Um, and and they want it to be rooted in an undertaking that is quick, easy, and systematic. And I think that the Taoist tradition has been screaming from the back row all along for 2,000 years so far, since the Celestial Masters at least, and I mean even the Tao Te Ching, that within the tradition there's this very distinct issue, which is, can you please just focus on being a good and loving person? Because without that, the rest of this stuff is absolutely meaningless. And it's so weird that we keep on habitually reducing Taoism to a series of knacks and tricks, no matter how sophisticated those are. But they're still just like, rhetorical syllogisms to trick the mind and this and that. It's just knacks and tricks and methods instead of
I
just
just
love
want
and
to
go ahead.
I want to jump into the guts of this a little bit, if you'll permit me, because I think that can open up
Yeah.
something. So one of the very interesting things in the historical trajectory of Taoism is during the Tang Dynasty, the figure Lu Dongbin really
Mhm.
changed a lot of things, and it really profoundly affected Taoism. And um, previously to that, the one of the very popular Taoist schools was the Shangqing school, the highest clarity school. And you can make many arguments about how they practice. Okay, we don't need to talk about that too much. But let me say that um, there was a tendency that developed over time, as far as I can tell, that people took many of their practices, which were things that involved invocation of deities, visualization,
Yeah.
incantations, and these kind of things, and they took them in directions which escaped the central premise of Taoism, which is again to return back to Tao and return back to virtue, and instead got into things which were more based on obtaining things in the postmordial realm. And when one of the things that I think that Lu Dongbin and his successors really did was defined more closely a particular view of Taoism where the Tao retains, uh, let's say, the most essential uh, place in the position and generates virtue from it. So virtue is derived from the goodness of the Tao rather than being derived from doing these tricks, as you say, using deities to get things that you want, invoking mass hallucination, right? And these kind of, which isn't bad necessarily, but it can be used obviously in a very bad way. We see that all the way into the 20th century in Qigong culture. And so then from what you're saying, I view sort of like a perimeter that describes the problem, but then there's the guts of the situation, which is taking these disparate practices and using them in ways that really are outside of what the Tao does and outside of what virtue does. Um, and so I wonder if you have any way that you can open that up and magnify it, or get
Yeah.
a farther away distance from it to look at it again.
Yeah. Well, there's an essential reciprocity between moral and ethical demeanor and the status of the mind. And the mind that is angry and the mind that is violent and the mind that is, I don't want to sound like a Calvinist or something, but lustful, I don't know, whatever the word, whatever you might say. I mean, we all have a problem innately with, you know, lust or lasciviousness. So these are evident in our precepts, by the way. But, you know, those, when people talk about meditation and the obstacles to meditation, they're oftentimes they're just going to talk about distraction. Um, and distractions come in the form of this emotionality and the emotionality's attempts at the acquisition of objects of whatever sort, whether they be mental objects or actual objects, longing for them or being repelled by them. So the the meditation, the act of meditation is sort of like, it's interesting for us in Longmen especially, the act of sitting down to meditate, that act of practice, that we use that term practice or whatever, as if that is the form in itself, exists in a vacuum, that practice is, so long as we isolate time in our day to do that, we can expect that to come to some sort of fruition or efficacy. The problem with that is that the full context or matrix within which that practice exists is literally the rest of that practice. So that practice is every waking thought and every sleeping dream that we have is part of the continuum of that meditation practice. That practice does not exist in isolation. And so without a really concerted effort throughout our day to act, think, and recognize the mechanisms of our mind in certain ways, then our hopes at meditational fruition, which in whatever that verbiage might be, realization, enlightenment, whatever you want to call it, there's 1,000 ways that people say it. You know, in Longmen, we recognize that without the stability of moral efficacy, Ling, like with the Ling that comes from moral rectification, without that efficacy, without stability, there can be no um, there can be no wisdom or realization, etc. So we we really have a continuum of practice that goes so far beyond the meditation cushion. Um, and people are like, well, when did that start? And I'm like, it started in the beginning. That's why there's a De section of the Tao Te Ching. It's like the very basis of our tradition, but we keep on saying, nope, can't be, that can't be. Why do people resist that so much? It's because that is our primary problem. It says it in the Qing Jing Jing, the Yin Fu Jing, the every Li Dao Chun. I mean, it's all over the place. Like the obstacle to us obtaining the Tao is our obsession with conventional reality. How can there be a recognition of ultimate reality when we're absolutely obsessed, body and mind, with conventions, things and ideas, the phantoms of, the conventional world? Until we start to like revert on those obsessions, we're never going to be in any sense, in any proximity to something ultimate, just like the Tao Te Ching's first line says.
Pregnant silence. Anyway, yeah, no, I mean, I think that the basically to bring it back a bit, that was very good, but also very heady. I have an interesting proposition,
Yeah,
and this proposition is that it might be useful. I don't just mean in the context of this conversation. I just mean in general for everybody who's involved in these practices and studies. It might be useful to define different areas, not just within Taoism, but just broadly different areas of things which we align with Taoism in our conceptions. And I'll say that in a general way first. You would never mistake Aristotle with Lao Tzu. You could read Aristotle and you could read Lao Tzu, and you get two different things. And every once in a while, there's some important parts that cross over, and you could say, well, these are, in harmony with each other in certain ways, and in other ways, they're not really in harmony with each other. But you certainly wouldn't confuse them.
right.
And then you should ask, why is it? So let's make another one that, anyway, it's far enough away from Taoism that it's not such a big jump. Why is it that we confuse martial arts for Taoism? And then
Yeah,
that one, some people are already going to start having a reaction. But then the next one is, why do we confuse Qigong with Taoism?
yeah,
And as you get more and more subtle, or you can get into these really fine, gradations of Qigong, you can talk about Daoyin or Tuna or whatever, and you can go all the way down to very fine grained stuff. But the fact of the matter is that there are things which are influenced by Taoism, and there are things which use some Taoist language to explain themselves, and sometimes they use Confucian language to explain themselves, with people misidentify as Taoist language.
yes,
But anyway, those things, they have their own purposes. Qigong has a purpose. Martial arts has a purpose. They're designed with an idea in mind. I should have mentioned Plato instead of Aristotle. There's a perfected form of martial arts that exists in the ether somewhere. There's a perfected form of Qigong that exists in the ether somewhere. And what they are isn't the same as the perfected form of Taoism that exists in the ether. But this is one of the foundational problems that we have, is that we have trouble understanding why is it, let's say a new student to Parting Clouds, why is it that my view of martial arts as a way to circulate energy doesn't seem to match up with what these people are telling me about getting myself straight with nature and destiny?
yeah. Oh, we are in such a this is a minefield because and it's a minefield not conceptually. This is a minefield because I feel very sensitive to the people who have put in a lot of decades or an entire lifetime into certain kinds of work in their martial arts journey, for instance, and they identify as a Taoist by virtue of that. And I'm not going to tell them, I feel so resistant to saying, but you're wrong about that. You know what I mean? Just because I don't want to be that cruel. Because I do think that that is a form of cruelty to sort of blind, you just sort of just like easily walk past with a few words here and there and unmoor someone's entire anchorage in their identity. Um, so I don't want to do that, and I want to figure out a way. If I could, I don't know if I can answer your question, but I do think that it's worth us, people like us, discussing like how can we bridge this for people versus how can we cut their anchor line and just let them drift away and go away from us. I don't want them to remove themselves. I think that they are vibrant members of the Taoist adjacent community. So how can we welcome them in to further substantiate this yearning that they've had towards Taoism, but they've only found access through martial arts or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how to say this really. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely. But
Yeah.
how about this? So because this is kind of like, we don't talk as much as we should. Like we should have a lot more conversations both in public and private because we should understand each other's positions better more often.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I'm really interested in is the idea of something called Dao study, Dao Shui,
Mm-hmm.
because Tao study is not necessarily moored within the tradition of a lineage of Taoism. It's not necessarily Taoism per se, because
Right.
Confucius also studies the Tao. And not only that, but many, many other people also study the Tao. You look at certain periods in history where people like Wang Bi and Guo Xiang and Ji Kang, and
Right.
these people were wandering around doing this thing which it's so Taoism, but it's not any of the Taoisms that we see expressed as a living tradition in that sense today. And so one of the things that I think is really important to consider is to say sometimes if we become very, very knowledgeable in a certain field or a certain area, we can look at other fields or areas and have some misgivings. And I'm going to take one which is simultaneously safe and incredibly dangerous, but I'm going to take the responsibility on myself. You didn't say this, it was me who's going to say it. You look at a place like places like Wudang, right? One
Mm-hmm.
of the things that they've done is they've really embraced martial arts and qigong culture.
Mm-hmm.
And some people, especially some academics, don't like that. They think that that's a negative thing, or it somehow is. I don't want to talk about the source of why they don't like it. I would feel like I would get in trouble.
Yeah.
But the more importantly, what if we looked at it saying this is an emergent trend within Taoism that we have to view as legitimate because the Taoist organizations in China, which are the authority on these things, view them as legitimate. Therefore, when we have this emerging trend, we should think about how it could be guided in a direction that it can improve over time. When something new happens, it's not good right away. The
Yeah.
first generation of Neidan after Lu Dongbin, there's some very crazy ideas,
Yes.
and
Yes.
and so if we think about it like that, I think we can become more accepting, and I've become more accepting and less surgical over the years as a result of taking on that view.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know how you think about that, but that's just one idea.
Yeah. Well, I think of all of this in an architectural sense. Like the lobby is part of the building, but it's part of the building that really orients you to like where you're going when you get into a place. That's where all of the signs are. That's where you're alerted to the fact that the elevators are over there. Welcome to the building. You're in here. You're out of the bad weather now. But now you have to pick which floor you're going to. And I feel like Wudang, in a sense, is a great lobby for Taoism. So just so the listener knows, like, Wudong has had a really interesting history since I think like 92. The place was nearly depopulated. It suffered greatly during the Cultural Revolution. There was a lot of there was a lot of there were a lot of problems. And in the 90s, there was another temple in China that was doing really well, and that was Shaolin. And it was doing really well, so much so that like it became in 94 when I was there, I was in China the first time in 90, but by 94, like most of the people that I knew, Shaolin was on their ticket. You know what I mean? Like that's where they were going to go. That's what they wanted to see. The Great Wall and the Shaolin Temple. And it was one of these it was a very energetic visit to go there, you know? And as a tourist destination, it was exceedingly successful. Didn't they even have like a Kentucky Fried Chicken in the temple at one point? I can't remember, but I
Oh my
think they
gosh.
might
My
have.
my wife,
Yeah.
I have lived very close to Shaolin for a long time in the past, and we never went there. We went to Jiaozuo where they grow those long
Yeah.
sweet potatoes. But we never went to Shaolin, but I've heard that they have wonderful shish kebab.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a really exciting tourist destination. And they have shows and demonstrations, and these are like real acrobatic athletes. Whether they're Zen monks in the tradition of Shaolin, that's the issue. They're not. They know that. They never say that they are. You know what I mean? Like most of them. But that model is what was imported to Wudang. And the problem with the Wudang situation, just like at Shaolin, was that they had to reconstruct the physical forms, essentially. So they were able to find people from around the country to sort of reconstruct and inform the forms from other places and create a construct. I mean, these aren't like unbroken lineages, is what I'm trying to say, what's existing there. Um, and so one of the broken parts of these reconstruction efforts is the religious component. It's much easier to make gymnasiums than it is to have functioning temples. And so the gymnasiums thrived first because they're far more energetic in a touristic way, and they're far more energetic in terms of the attraction of adherents and energy to that place in that location, and to create the vibrant interest that will put tiles back on temple roofs, you know? Like when I was in college in 94 in Kunming, I was there doing Taoist studies, and I would go to a lot of Taoist temples where half of the temple was destroyed still, the remnants of the revolution, the Cultural Revolution. So since the 60s, they were flat, tiles everywhere in the dirt. I would pick up tiles. I literally I brought home roof tiles from these destroyed temples with little labels like this one comes from this temple, this one from that, because I felt like these were distant memories, and I had these touched. I don't know if I should have done that, by the way. I probably shouldn't have, but the round end caps on the tiles, I have a few of those. Anyway, um, but to those temples now, those ones in Kunming that were then destroyed are now pretty much tourist attractions. They do reenactments there. They have like music playing and things like that, but they never really became Taoist temples again. But they certainly are cultural attractions. And I think like part of the legacy of Chinese political history recently is that we're going to see like various iterations of this. Even the great temples that were consistently occupied by Taoists and never really disappeared, were burnt down or flattened, even they have to play this very delicate dance of being like a place for people to visit, a place for tourists to come, but also a place for Taoists to do Taoist things. And so I think it's only fair that every Taoist temple is subject to the same sort of criticism, or not, is it criticism? I'm not really criticizing any of them actually, but the same kind of like deep inspection. Like they all have to do this thing where they they have to create a vibrant, attractive energy. And then I started thinking, is this just a modern thing? And then I realized, like, thinking about the things that I've read about temples from the beginning of, no, it's not. I mean, they've always had to be a vibrant part of the community to instill and invigorate the people in ideas into the people, invigorate them in religious ways and other ways too, cultural and in various arts. And so they've always done this. And so for Wudang to recognize we have a tradition of martial arts, let's reconstruct that. Let's focus on that at first. Wudang is becoming more and more actually a religious place year by year. So right now it might not be perfect, and it definitely wasn't in the 90s, but it's certainly moving towards a real religious mountain again, a la the Ming Dynasty when it was really flourishing in its heyday. So, I feel like it's okay. This is what people have to do to survive and to reestablish roots and to, this is how we fertilize these traditions. We just, we work with what we've got. We create the excitement and then we go from there. I don't know. I'm not over there. I wasn't born there. Um, but I do know that they've had their issues and this is how they're working their way out of them.
One of the other things I think is really a potent way to further inspect what you just said is that when you look at other places that are outside of the mainland Chinese continent, country,
Yeah. Yeah.
how Taoism is expressed in Malaysia, how Taoism is expressed even in places that are inside of China, like Hong Kong, but which
Yeah.
had previously been separated, or
Yeah.
places which are in this, unusual gray space like Taiwan. Um, there's also this, and Taiwan is really interesting because there's this really profound tension in the Taiwanese Taoist scene between different gradations of folk temples that are really not quite within the Orthodox Taoist world. I mean, Orthodox in the sense of being either Zhengyi or Chuanzhen, right?
Yeah,
And
mainline.
and and then at the same time, this expression of a Taoism in the street, in ceremonies with parishioners, which by the way used to happen in every Chinese place that had a Taoist temple, and maybe
Yeah.
still does to some extent. But and this kind of expression of individual people who might not even know what sect they belong to, but they do all of the things they need to do for their ancestors and so on, and you just see it expressed in incredibly diverse ways. But at the same
Yeah.
time, there's a tension, and I see the Taiwanese Taoists sometimes really, being at odds ends with folk practices that are Taoist adjacent, where certain putting the star in the wrong place on a on a star chart or something like that that's on the temple's wall will evoke great anger, and it's understandable because they're having this cultural conversation which is inherently Chinese that we sort of have to view as outsiders even if we know a lot about it. um, but it's an interesting way to then look back at the issue in, I don't want to just pick Wudang, let's say the Chinese Taoist issue of things creeping into Taoism from other places that are awkwardly placed that have to be identified and molded, right? There's I think because one of the things that happens sometimes, very rarely now, it was more prevalent before, but there used to be this thing where people would perhaps have experience in places like Taiwan or Hong Kong before it went even now, right? Because Hong Kong has its own view of Taoism in a lot of ways, where they would look then at these things that were happening in the mainland and they would, oh, they disparage it so much, but really actually it's prevalent everywhere where there's Taoism.
Yeah, so Jack's my partner and co-founder of Parting Clouds. We have a deep interest in diaspora communities because in those communities we have found incredible narratives around Taoist tradition that are really distinct from the mainline traditions of Chuanzhen and Zhengyi on the mainland in particular. Um, and I have a really deep interest um, in the traditions in Singapore, Malaysia, and Taiwan in particular. Um, the 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 hold on, can you hold on one second?
Yeah, yeah,
My
absolutely.
um the these communities incorporate things that were part of Taoism on the mainland, possibly way before. I'm not talking about by the way, the delineating the demarcation for me, people always jump to 1949 as like the demarcation of when the real stuff ended or something like that, but that's not at all the case. Like, as you know, in Chinese medicine, that's always bandied, no, it's always 49. The there was a diminishment of certain cultural tropes that started way earlier than that and was flourishing in the Qing dynasty. I mean, like, Chinese people were running from Chinese traditions by the Qing dynasty, in flocks. So, but these communities are they're like time capsules in Singapore, for instance, like the or Malaysia, the Dangi practitioners. This is mediumship. This is not textually based, not scripturally based, not doctrinally based. These people go into a trance, they become the deity, and the deity talks directly to people. The intercession or the interventions of doctrine and all of these things that slow direct experience down just don't exist for these certain practitioners. I find that really interesting. This totally visceral, spiritual um, permutation of Taoism that lacks like this very important, like, in the Chuanzhen temples, it is very like almost Catholic. We have mass every morning essentially, and every evening, and probably in the middle of the day too. And there's musical rules and regulations that are throughout the various temples. There's regionality to this, obviously, but like it's orthodoxy is a term that really like fits well with what's going on with Chuanzhen, and it always, it really has since the Qing dynasty and Longmen been a very orthodox community. Um, and so these diaspora communities offer up a time machine, literally, for us as Taoists, house or hall of mirrors, to go in and just completely mess with our very like rigid views on like this is what Taoism is and this is how it's practiced, and then you go to these other places and you're like, oh wow, I had it all wrong. This is so much more diverse than I thought. It's so much richer and varied and, multifaceted. And it kind of broke me free from some pretty rigid slash judgmental ways of being, um, because I've definitely suffered from that. And I think that,
Haven't we all?
yeah, yeah, I think that seeing things that have nothing in common with your view, but they're still called Taoist and they're authentically so, is really healthy for us as practitioners. And I think that this issue, and I'm going to bring this back, this issue of like the martial artist for us in Taoist circles is really interesting in that way because there are some really interesting ways in which martial arts and Taoism can have these some bridges formed between us. Because a lot of Taoist ritual has physical movements in it, and those physical movements, many of them can be like very closely related to some martial forms and the nomenclature around martial forms. And I think like if we just, bridge the gap and allow people to just find a vehicle for their interest and for their enthusiasm that will drive them into the tradition of Taoism from martial arts without making them feel alienated or like they're abandoning something, I think that would be awesome, you know.
Good.
And
I think that, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
they themselves will then come to the realization like, oh, they're not the same. And like religious doctrine and all of these things and meditation and the ultimate and the conventional and all of the things that we talk about in scripture and text and lineage and all of these things, yeah, you're not, that stuff doesn't exist in martial arts. It's just not there. You know what I mean? Like martial arts is martial arts. And these practices in Taoism are Taoism. And I think that once a friendly bridge is made, then there doesn't have to be issues of abandonment and judgment because we could do without that stuff because it doesn't get anyone anywhere.
Yeah, that's a very true statement. I think that now it may be a good idea for us to put a bookmark in here because
Mm,
it seems like this is, this is a very long conversation. It would take a long time to fully extinguish the entire magnitude of the conversation, even just within the very small perspectives that both of us have. And the broader
yeah,
issue itself is gigantic. Even it exists greatly beyond the limited views of either of us. So if we were to put a bookmark in it here, but then maybe consider picking it up again at a later time, that might be really great. What do you think?
I think that's great. I do
Okay.
want I
Yeah.
do want to continue this conversation because and I think that if we allow it to um, stew a little, we can probably both come up with some good perspectives on it too, and
Yeah, and I'm
maybe
sure
even
there's room for others also to be involved in it.
yeah, yeah, for feedback in other ways too. Yeah, I love that. Let's do it.
Right on. Now, um, you know, you have to promote what you're doing. That's
Yeah,
our role here.
yeah. So um, I am essentially just a representative of a beautiful Taoist community called Parting Clouds, and we are community based and community oriented. We are not, our goal is not just the dissemination of information, it is the formation of a community. And that community is very supportive and very wonderful, and I'm really happy to be a part of it. So we teach every Tuesday. I think Jack and I currently are teaching 6 hours on Tuesdays, straight, with different cohorts along the way. And none of it feels tiring. It's absolutely inspiring hour by hour. And so that's what we do. And we can be reached at our website. On another note, though, I think one thing that I'm promoting here today is a more personal thing, and that is that if you are listening to this and you are a Taoist or a martial artist and you want to have a friend in the Taoist/martial artist world, I'm your guy. That's what I want. I'm tired of all the ridiculous, like behind the scenes backstabbing and stuff that seems to be very common in these worlds. So if you're tired of it too, reach out. You have a friend who's definitely willing to talk, and I really, really yearn for a broader Taoist community. Robbie, your community and ours is an example. You and Jack and I have been really close friends for a long time. Our communications are really healthy and very stabilizing for me because I feel like, you know, it's so good to have this notion that we're all mutually supporting each other out there, even though we do different things. And so I think like I'm not asking people to that I don't want to be like you and you don't have to be like me, but we certainly can support each other. And that's my main mission right now. Parting clouds and the healing of the Taoist world, because there's enough problems in the world and we could all be a significant cure to a lot of those problems if we work together.
Marvelous. Great words. So, everybody, thank you very much for watching. Josh, please stick around for just a minute after I turn off the recording. But everyone, thank you very much for watching.
Yeah.
You've seen something. I think that this is really special. This is unusual stuff. We don't hear it. We don't hear about it that much, to be honest. And so I was just absolutely delighted when it became possible to have this interview with Josh. We did previously speak to Jack, who's the co-founder of Parting Clouds. So now you have both of them, and you have similar views that also have some sort of unique interpretive characteristics. And I think it's really been a delight. So thank you very much, Josh.
Oh, thank you.
And I'll look forward to being able to pick up this conversation again in this medium and in other mediums. So with that, I wish everybody a very good morning, evening, night, or you should probably be in bed. And we'll see you in the next one.